Some doors are locked to keep people out. This one was locked from the inside. Marcus Webb was tearing his family's smokehouse apart for scrap lumber, a Saturday chore, nothing more, when his crowbar broke through a board and hit air. Not dirt, not the hillside stone that should have backed that wall for 90 years. Just a black, hollow gap, and somewhere inside it, catching the beam of his flashlight, an iron handle, a door sealed into solid stone, braced shut from the other side. By sundown, the only man left alive who might know why would rather lose a friendship of 40 years than say the word out loud. Stay with this one, because what Marcus found behind that wall didn't just rewrite his family's history. It's still sitting out there in his backyard right now. Marcus Webb didn't expect the crowbar to go through the wall. He'd been working the same board for maybe 10 minutes. Soft, rotted wood. The kind that usually just crumbles when it tore loose all at once, cracking to quiet like a rifle shot. Dust hung in the morning light. And behind it, where 90 years of packed hillside earth should have been, there was nothing. Just a gap. Just dark. He froze. Crowbar still raised, staring into a space that, by every law of how buildings get built into a slope, should not exist. He pulled his phone from his back pocket, thumbed the flashlight on, leaned in close enough to feel the cold coming off the stone. The beam caught metal, not a nail, not scrap from the original frame. A handle, iron, sunk into rock that had no business holding a door at all. Marcus stepped back like the wall had reached out and touched him first. His neighbor, an older man who'd wandered over that morning just to watch a young farmer take apart a building older than either of them, walked up and looked into the gap. That always there? I don't know, Marcus said, and for a long moment, that was the last thing either of them said. Marcus just stood in his own backyard, staring at a structure he'd walked past his entire life, understanding for the first time that he didn't actually know it at all. He was 38 that spring, back on the 60 acres in rural Kentucky his family had worked for 4 generations, trying to hold together a farm his grandfather had let rot quietly in his final years, the kind of decline nobody in that family ever said out loud. A barn roof you could see daylight through. Fence line untouched in a decade. 2 dead tractors rusting in the equipment shed. A bank that had stopped being patient a long time before Marcus ever moved back. Farming wasn't the plan. 12 years in HVAC. 3 counties over, coming home weekends, until funeral turned weekends into the only option he had left. Selling the land crossed his mind more than once, more than he liked to admit. On the nights the numbers refused to add up no matter how many times he ran them. But walking away from ground his family had held through 2 world wars, and the depression didn't sit right in his chest. So he stayed, patched what he could, let the rest wait its turn. At the back of the property, right where the yard met the tree line, sat the Smokehouse, stone and timber, built by his great-grandfather sometime around 1930. Nobody had used it in Marcus's lifetime. Roof sagging, door hanging off one hinge. Inside, the first time he worked up the nerve to check. Rusted meat hooks, a cracked smoke pit, cobwebs thick enough to catch a fist. He needed the stone. He needed the timber more. That fence line alone would eat every board of it. Tearing the place down wasn't a hard call. It was the obvious one. That call was what cracked everything open. Working the boards loose that first morning, something nagged at him. The back wall ran thicker than the rest. Too thick for a building that size. And it didn't look raised all at once, the way the front and sides had been. It looked added onto, built up from the inside, after the fact. He found a second layer of mortar under the first. Different color, different age. Stones of mismatched size worked in among the originals, like someone had run out of matching material halfway through and just made do. Nails driven in backward, heads buried instead of showing. The mark of someone who didn't want this wall examined too closely, ever. And under a warped board, he almost tossed without a second look, a hinge. Rusted, half-buried, but unmistakably a hinge. Somebody, once, had gone to real trouble to make sure nobody looked twice at that wall. Marcus worked the mortar free with the edge of the crowbar. Slow, until the outline of a second door showed clean against the stone. When he finally closed his hand around the handle and pulled, nothing. It didn't budge. Not locked. He checked every inch of frame for a mechanism and found none. Something heavy was braced across it from the inside. That detail changed the whole shape of what he was looking at. A hidden room was strange enough on its own. A hidden room somebody had barred shut from within, sealed themselves out of on purpose, was something else entirely. He drove into town that same afternoon, straight to the one man left alive old enough to have known his great-grandfather personally. Otis Reed, 91 years old, a retired preacher, sharp-eyed and sitting on his porch like he'd been expecting this visit for longer than Marcus had been alive. Marcus told him what he'd found. Otis didn't look surprised. That was the first thing Marcus noticed. No shock, no confusion, just a long silence, and eyes that drifted toward the tree line instead of meeting his. "Your great-granddaddy never talked about that room," he said. "What room?" Otis didn't answer that question. He rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, and walked back inside his house, leaving Marcus standing alone on the porch steps with far more questions than he'd arrived with, and the growing feeling that some things in his family had been buried on purpose by people who meant for them to stay that way. If a door somebody sealed themselves out of has you leaning in right now, that's exactly where this story is headed. Subscribe before part 2, because Otis Reed isn't just protecting a memory, he's protecting a promise. And what's actually sitting behind that wall is about to change how you see every quiet old farmer you've ever passed on the road. Otis Reed walked away rather than answer one question. What room? That night, Marcus Webb went back out to the smokehouse with a saw, and what he cut his way into wasn't gold. It wasn't moonshine. It was something that would take him 3 days to fully understand, and by the time he did, he'd stop calling it a secret at all. Marcus drove home with Otis's silence, sitting heavier on him than anything the old man could have actually said. A locked room, a neighbor who wouldn't talk. It was the kind of thing that got a man's imagination running toward buried money, bootleg whiskey, some family shame nobody had wanted dug up. He didn't know which possibility unsettled him more, only that he needed to know which one it actually was. He went back out to the smokehouse that evening with a handsaw. Whatever was braced across the inside of that door was thick. It took him nearly 20 minutes of steady cutting before he felt it give. The door swung open on its own weight, groaning against a hinge that hadn't moved in decades. Inside was a room roughly 8 feet by 10, dry, undisturbed. It smelled like old wood and dust, not the damp rot he'd braced himself for. There was no chest of coins, no hidden still, nothing like what a man might imagine, walking out there with a saw in his hand, and his heart going too fast. Instead, wooden shelves lined the walls, holding rows of glass jars, most empty now, labels faded past reading, burlap sacks, folded flat, stacked in the corner, a rusted balance scale, a tin of salt, wooden crates along the back wall, and on the shelf nearest the door, a notebook. Marcus picked it up and opened the cover. On the first page, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line, 1933 to 1938. He sat down on one of the crates and started reading. It wasn't a diary. It read like a ledger, page after page of names, dates, and quantities. Flour, cornmeal, smoked pork, dried beans. Beside each name, a number. The Hendersons, 10 pounds flour. Boyd family, 2 jars meat. R. Coleman, 1 sack corn. Names Marcus half recognized. Families whose grandkids he'd gone to school with. Some he didn't know at all. He assumed at first his great-grandfather had run some quiet trade out of that back room. Food for cash. Off the books. But there wasn't a single dollar figure written anywhere. No column for payment. Just names, dates, and what had been taken. He kept turning pages. Entries ran steady from 1933 through 1936. Then, starting in 1937, the names on each page jumped sharply. More families in a single month than had appeared across whole years before. Some repeated month after month. The same handful of households drawing on the same staples again and again. Others appeared once and never again. Like whatever trouble brought them there had passed as fast as it came. And the handwriting wasn't always the same. Most of it matched a careful, even hand Marcus took to be his great-grandfather's. But every so often, a looser, quicker hand took over, as if someone else had been trusted to keep the book running on the days the old man couldn't get to himself. He brought the ledger to Otis the next morning. This time, the old man was ready to talk. Otis told him that in the mid-1930s, that whole stretch of Kentucky had gone through a run of bad years. Drought stacked on top of the Depression, one failed harvest after another, until it wasn't just one family going hungry. It was most of the county. Farms up and down that valley had come up short, and there wasn't much slack left in anybody's pantry by the time winter came. Marcus's great-grandfather's place had fared a little better. A working spring, a smokehouse that still had meat in it, seed put back from a decent crop the year before. Rather than let that sit behind a locked barn while neighbors went without, he'd turned the back room of the smokehouse into something like a reserve. Anyone in the community who needed something could come and take it. Nobody paid. Nobody signed anything promising to pay it back. "Why didn't anybody ever tell me?" Marcus asked. Otis looked at him a long moment. "Because your great-granddaddy didn't want anyone to." That was the point. The story stopped being about a room and started being about the man who built it. A few days later, going back through the shelves, Marcus found a narrow gap beneath the bottom one. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Inside was a sealed envelope, the paper gone brittle and yellow. On the outside, in the same hand as a ledger, "If this room is ever opened again." He opened it. The letter wasn't written to be remembered by. It was plain, the way the old man must have talked, explaining that a person who has to ask for food carries that feeling the rest of their life, and he'd rather nobody in the community carry it if he could help it. That was why there was no debt recorded anywhere, no signatures, no accounting of who owed what, just names and numbers, kept quietly, for no reason except to remember who needed help and when. At the bottom, one line, in the same steady hand: "Take what your family needs. Leave what the next family may need." Marcus sat with that letter a long time before folding it and setting it back on the shelf. Down in one of the crates, under a folded sack, he found a small tin box. Old seed packets, brittle with age. Corn, beans, squash. Across each one, in the same handwriting, "Plant enough for 2 families." He didn't throw them out. He set some aside and planted a test row that spring, more out of curiosity than expectation. By early summer, the first shoots came up green out of ground that hadn't been worked in years. Marcus didn't try to build anything grand out of what he'd found. He did something simpler. He repaired the room, left the smokehouse standing instead of finishing the teardown, and set a plain wooden table just outside the door. That fall, without much announcement, just word passed around at church and the feed store, neighbors started showing up with what they could spare. Vegetables from a garden that had produced more than one family could use. Smoked meat, a sack of seeds saved back from someone's own crop. An older woman brought a box of empty glass jars, the same kind that sat on those shelves for 80 years, and left without a word. Otis came by one evening that fall, walking slower than the day Marcus had first gone looking for answers. He stood in the doorway a long while, looking at the shelves at the table outside, at a jar of green beans somebody had left that morning that Marcus hadn't found a place for yet. "Your great-granddaddy would have liked that you didn't put a sign on it," he said. "Didn't seem like it needed one," Marcus said. Otis nodded slow, the way a man does when something's finally settled right in his mind after sitting wrong for a long time. Marcus set the ledger back on its shelf. He didn't log names and numbers the way a bank might have wanted. He turned to the last blank page, and beneath the final entry from 1938, in his own hand, he wrote a single year, this year. Below it, one line: "The room is open again." The smokehouse still stands at the back of Marcus Webb's yard, weathered and plain from the road, giving no hint of what's behind that second door. But most mornings now, there's something waiting on the table outside it. And most evenings, a little less than there was that morning. If a story about a locked door and a promise kept for 90 years meant something to you, that's exactly the kind of story this channel is built on. Subscribe and tell us in the comments, would you have torn the whole smokehouse down or stopped the second you felt that hollow space behind the wall?